two stories. First is the story about a seeker after truth who came to a great master and asked, "Master, what is enlightenment?" And the master said, "Let me tell you a story." He said there was a king. He wasn't always a king. He started out as a warrior, as many kings did. But when he became king and he found himself in this supreme position with all of the slaves and servants and yes men and advisors gathered around him, he became very self-centered and very indolent, so that with the indulgences that he was able to participate in, he became quite bloated, and it came to a time when he was quite satiated with all of the pleasures that were available to him. He did not have a queen, but he had a lot of slaves, and he had a lot of consorts and concubines. But he did arrive at that time when it was all too much for him, that he had just more than enough of the pleasures of life. But then, of course, Buddhism had come to his realm, and he had learned about selfless giving, or bodhicitta. So he decided that he would turn himself around and become one of these selfless beings. And so he started to give out to his populace, but he soon found that he began to become quite thin, and he would be tossing and turning at night because of all the problems that had come to him during the day that he was expected to solve. So there came a time when he was so emaciated and worn out that he just could not continue to do what he had been doing. So in this state, he completely decided that there was nothing more that he had to give. So he decided to give over his realm to a regent and shave his head and go off into the wilderness. And this is exactly what he did. He went off and found himself a forest somewhere that was beside a small village, and he spent his days in contemplation and being one with the animals and nature around him. But every day he took it upon himself to take his begging bowl into town to beg for alms. But each day when he went, there happened to be a maiden who was serving in her father's stall, where the monk frequented to be given some small dates or fruit to sustain him. But this maiden, because even though with his shaven head and his monk's robes, the king had a regal air, an air of nobility about him, and he was still a handsome and virile-looking man. So the maiden fell hopelessly in love with him, to the state where she waited with bated breath every day until he came into town. But then she started to grow wan because the monk would not give her any attention or assuage her in any way with the longing that she had for him. So she grew thin and pale, and when she was questioned about this from her parents, she admitted that she was hopelessly in love with the monk. Well, they were totally unable to know what to do. They did not want to lose their beloved daughter, but knowing that a monk, as monks were supposed to take a vow of celibacy, but they came to a point of desperation. So they went to the monk in his forest glade and they told him of the situation, that their daughter was totally and absolutely infatuated with him, and that she was threatening death if she could not marry him and be with him. So the monk looked at the parents and said, "I will marry her." And so he discarded his monk's robes, put on the garb of an ordinary man, and the wedding took place. He became a devoted and exemplary husband, and the couple became very devoted to one another, taking up the task of being basket weavers to enable them to make a living. But it was soon found that those who bought the baskets from them had boons in their life. The baskets seemed to bring a harmony and good things to those who purchased them. And it was found by those who came to the small house where they plied their trade, that when they came into the presence of the monk who was, and he would go about his weaving as he greeted them and interacted with them and listened to them, but each and every one of those who came found that in his presence it seemed to be that on his lips was a constant, silent prayer. And then the second story is about the great king who was deemed to be, and considered to be, as deeming means of course, to be enlightened. Now this king had 4 daughters, and these 4 daughters had been wedded to princes from various distant realms. But it was the 4th prince, the husband of the 4th daughter, who had heard about this enlightened state and had aspirations himself to attain this state. So he decided to go and visit his father-in-law, to learn from him, to observe him. And when he did, to his very great surprise, he found that the king had a large bevy of beauties in his harem. He loved to be entertained by the jugglers, the singers, and the dancers who came into his kingdom. He loved good food and the company of those who came. So the prince, observing this, could not help but be perplexed. How could it be that this king, who was indulgent or embracing all manner of the ways of life with aplomb and enjoyment, when this was not what he considered to be the state of enlightenment to be? But of course the king, being an enlightened soul, was already aware of the prince's dilemma. So one day he approached the prince and he said, "Would you like to come with me on a tour of my palace?" Well, the prince already knew the palace very well. He'd traversed its corridors and its aisles and its reception rooms and chambers. But he could not refuse the king's request. But before they set off, the king called a servant to him and whispered in the servant's ear, and the servant came back very shortly with a bowl filled to the brim with coconut oil. King said, "Come, let us go on our palace tour, but please be careful not to spill a drop of this oil." Now the king took the prince down the corridors, down the basement, where they came past the kitchens, where there was the aromatic smell of cardamom and cumin and pheasants cooking. They went along those places where the dancing girls came by with their anklets jingling and passed by. They went to the magnificent chambers where the glittering chandeliers twinkled above them, room after room, corridor after corridor, chamber after chamber. So when they arrived back at the place where they had started out, the king said to the prince, "Well, what did you think of my palace?" And the prince says, "I was aware of everything that was happening and all that each of the areas was, but I could not be distracted because I could not allow myself to spill a drop of this oil." So the king gently looked at the prince and said, "Could this be the state of enlightenment to which you aspire?" So we can ask ourselves, what is this silent prayer that was on the lips of the king who became a monk and then a dutiful husband? What is the meaning of holding the bowl of oil so that not a drop is spilt, while still being aware of all of what life presents around us? And how does this relate to what is called the state of enlightenment? What say you? Have you pondered this state in relationship to where you are now? Like asking ourselves, am I enlightened? What does enlightenment mean?